Hey there. So today I'm going to be talking about the metagame in Star Wars Unlimited right now. I'm going to be reviewing what I think are the main players in the current metagame and also some decks that might be waiting in the wings, might be able to make an impact during the next month and a half while we still are in just that set one card pool. Soon we'll have another card pool. All of this will change drastically, most likely. But until then, I think it's good to keep up with what's going on, what decks are kind of winning tournaments, what decks are performing well, and talk about them. So breakdown here is going to be, I'm not really going to do tier lists. I think right now, I think it's more mixed than just ranking them by tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. I'm going to be breaking down the decks by kind of the buckets they fall in, whether they're aggro, midrange, or control, and the things that are kind of in between these main archetypes. I'm not going to be reviewing deck lists during this video. If you want to see some sample deck lists, I spoke with TD Tata, John Tata, who recently wrote an article on Star Wars Unlimited.gg. There's going to be a link to that in the description. He said it was okay to share that here. I just want to point out I'm not affiliated with that website. I did not design the decks that are in his article, but I think it's a great source. He also wrote about his interpretation of the metagame, so it'd be a nice thing to check out as well. But yeah, if you just want some sample deck lists for the decks that I'm going to be talking about, a lot of them will be there. All right, first bucket is aggro, okay? Sabine, in particular, has been very prominent from the start of the Star Wars Unlimited competitive tournament scene. It's still there. I think we got two main versions right now, the Sabine Green, using Energy Conversion Lab to kind of ambush its K2 and Steadfast Battalions for giant swing turns. And then Sabine Yellow, which leverages Millennium Falcon and Surprise Strike, and then also has access to Spark of Rebellion, the discard card, which has been more impactful recently with the rise of these hard control decks. In addition to this, we got Boba Yellow now. Boba Yellow's been it's been a great deck kind of from the start, has been solidified recently with a recent Connecticut 1K win by Mike Gem to kind of be considered, in my opinion, one of the premier decks. I put this in this bucket. It is, for me, essentially an aggro deck. It does not, I think it very easily races decks like Sabine. I don't think it necessarily ever needs to really be the control in that matchup outside of leveraging cards like Shoot First to kind of get ahead on board, and then sometimes using effective trades with Seven Fleet Defender. But for the most part, this is an aggro deck. It's trying to get under basically any deck except maybe Sabine. Even in contrast with the other version of Boba that's very strong, the green one, this is definitely the aggro in that matchup, and that's why it falls in this bucket. All three of these decks, I would say, are very good choices into an open metagame right now. I would lean towards the green Sabine personally because I think it has a better matchup into the Sabine Yellow. So if they play a Sabine mirror, I think the one with Energy Conversion Lab will come out ahead most of the time. Although there are some situations where the yellow might be better. I think specifically if you're trying to leverage Spark of Rebellion in certain matchups, it's a strong thing to be doing, and naturally Millennium Falcon and Surprise Strike are very strong. I don't have much stake in either of these. It's just from my testing and my experience and the people I speak with a lot, who I trust their opinions, I'd lean more green, but I understand the arguments for yellow. And then in Boba Yellow's side, I think he's got just a fantastic matchup spread right now. It doesn't get blown out by anything. Unlike the Boba Green deck, which has a really hard time with these hard control decks, having access to Bodhi specifically, and then also Cunning, which is another burst damage card, right? We're trying to close out games quick. Those two cards in particular I think do better job into the control matchups versus the green cards that Boba Green has, thus making him more suitable for beating those decks. I love this Boba yellow deck. I think if you want to be kind of safe, I think it's a very good choice. There's not much that really eats it up. All right, small mid-range. So I broke up the mid-range into two. We got small and big. These are the decks I'd classify as small mid-range. By that, I mean these are decks that are not trying to play very long games most of the time. They are definitely slower than the three decks I just spoke about, the Sabine and Boba Yellow. But in general, they are still pretty aggressively slanted. They are trying to close out games fairly quick. Boba Green, this has been kind of like the boogeyman for most of this set's existence. It is a very streamlined deck that does some very powerful things, has some of the most absurd turn threes imaginable. It's clean. It wins a lot. It has an issue, though, with the hard control decks, the ones using like Entrenched for removal, the ones that aren't playing very many units, that are not allowing it to kind of snowball its game plan with extra resources. And that's kind of where it's at. I still think a very good choice. I think sideboards and even main decks might need to change a little bit for it to better fight these hard control decks. I think Confiscate, for instance, is a card you're going to need to start including in the sideboard because getting your Boba entrenched is devastating. But yeah, still a very good choice. Then we got Churret Red, which is, maybe I'm a little biased to include this here. It might not deserve it. It has certainly not won any major events recently that I'm aware of. The reason I include it here mostly is because I feel like it's a deck that doesn't really ever get smashed. I think if you want a deck that no matter who you sit across the table from, you have a chance, it's a good choice. On the flip side, though, it's also a deck that doesn't really smash anything. I think most of your wins you're going to have to earn, you're going to have to grind for, which can also be a little stressful. Because of the red package that this presents with Force Throw, K2, and Force Surrender, it's always got game into control decks just by ripping their hands to shreds. It's got good red and blue removal and a decent amount of restoring cards, whether they're Yoda or Kanan, or being able to play Vigilance for 6, that it can compete with the aggro decks. And then, it's got very big swing turns as well, maybe not as devastating as Boba's, but, a Churret flip turn that includes like a Forces with Me and a Force Throw, or like a Jedi Lightsaber and a Force Throw. Those create some really swingy game states, and that's what allows it to compete with the other mid-range decks. It keeps pressure. It's got the very aggressive 2-drops, A-Wing and Sabine. And then, yeah, it's just a solid deck. I think it's got a lot of play. It's not going to give you any easy wins, though. And as such, it's sometimes difficult to like stomach, right? You're going to have to really grind a lot of games. All right, now we got big mid-range. So got Han Green here, which I think it's recently been performing better than it was originally. These decks have gotten tuned. They've learned some play lines that allow it to not get completely blown out all the time by Boba, although I think most Boba decks are still pretty significantly favored into Han because they come out before him. They have a lot of cards that interact very well with him, like No Good to Me Dead, Surprise Strike, turning most of their units into one-shots against him. And in general, just being a little too quick a lot of the time for Han's big mid-range plan to kind of go into effect. But Han's big mid-range plan is very strong. His ability to ramp kind of nonstop and go into big 7-drops like the Han unit, and then specifically go into home 1 loops late in the game, allows it to grind out. Even against some control decks, it can grind out because of home 1. And then there's other cards in the deck that allow it to buy back units, like the ambush rogue skirmisher, the 4/6 ambush vehicle that lets it stock up on cards. Mon Mothma lets it get mini 2-for-1 values. Bright Hope, right? It can grind really well. It's got decent matchups into aggro decks. Hans in general do, because they're just able to like play bigger units on curve than Sabine. And yeah, I think it's a solid choice. I think you're still probably a little behind against Boba, but that's okay. Boba is no longer, I think, the like de facto #1 deck that you're going to end up bumping into. So as Boba numbers might come down, Han numbers might be able to come up. And the other big mid-range deck would, in my opinion, would be like a Darth Vader Energy Conversion Lab deck, or you can play that, I guess, with the 30 health base. This to me is not a control deck, although it sometimes gets like placed in that bucket. Darth Vader's trying to kill you pretty quickly. I think it creates chip damage throughout the game because it plays a lot of like weenies most of the time in order to like be able to combat aggro decks. Its front ability pings. He's got cards like Ruthless Raider in his deck that do chip damage. And then when he comes out, typically you're trying to close the game out fairly quick. It's a strong deck. It does pretty well into Boba decks because like they have a hard time dealing with the Vader, and often his unit and removal package is good enough to stall them out. It struggles still pretty significantly with Sabine decks, more so than like Han or the other mid-range decks. Vader definitely has a worse matchup into Sabine, but typically a better matchup into Boba Fett. It can also fight these control decks. Again, it does have some aggressive units, right? You're playing 3-1s for one. You're playing 2-1s in the space a lot of the time, like the TIE LN. Like you are pressuring early, and then you've got Vader, right? Vader can close out games pretty quickly. You are also in the colors that will allow you to play into big capital ships, especially Relentless, which is a good card into the control decks. So I think it's a solid choice. And has definitely been refined a bit to not like be an auto loss into Sabine. All right, soft control. These decks, in my opinion, this bucket is right now like at the weakest point it's been in a long time. We got Palp on the left here, which I know maybe people would consider that a big, like a hard control deck. I think it still falls into the soft control deck primarily because it's still a unit-focused control deck that is trying to flip control of the board with the powerful units that it plays, like Darth Vader, Reinforcement Walker. It's stalling to this point with Sentinels like the Royal Guard, sometimes Childson, sometimes Baze, right? It's playing Overwhelming Barrage as its main swing removal, which requires units in play. For my purposes, I still place this as a soft control deck. It tries to win with damage once it takes control of the board, and as such, it sometimes can struggle into the hard control decks because they're not really playing units. They're just trying to like remove your units, and all three of these decks, the Iden, Krennic Green, and Palp Blue, do try to win with units. Now, I think Palp has a much better chance of beating the hard control decks than the Iden and Krennic because the Palp leader is much more impactful. But on the flip side, it has a much harder time beating Sabine's. Palp has a really bad matchup into Sabine. Sabine is very popular, so it's a tough justification a lot of the time. The flip side, I'll talk about Iden and Krennic kind of together. These are similar decks. People got preferences as to which one they like more, but essentially they still play the same way. They are control decks that then try to leverage similar things that the Palp deck does. They're mainly big units like Vader, depending on how big you want to go after that. Some of these play capital ships, some don't. Some of these play super laser blast, some don't. But these decks have a really, really hard time with the red-blue control decks or the mono-blue control decks that are not playing units, that are just trying to mill you out and remove all your stuff. You need to kind of decide if you want to be prepped main board for that matchup by including your own copies of Restock and other such anti-mill things like Spark of Rebellion to rip out your opponent's Restocks, Bounty Hunter Cruise to kind of buy back your Restocks. Like, you have to decide if you want to play that game, and if you do, should you even be in this blue-green deck in the first place? Now, Iden and Krennic do fight pretty well into Sabines and Bobas. Such, they do deserve a mention here. Although this whole bucket as a whole, I think is kind of going through a little bit of an identity crisis. It needs to find a way to like kind of be able to compete with the polar ends, right? The Sabines and the hard control decks. And right now, I don't think these decks are matching up on both ends. It doesn't mean they can't come in and win a tournament with good matchups. It just means that they might be a step behind in terms of like how prominent they'll be in a big metagame. All right, and lastly, hard control. We got Vader Blue, which won that tournament in Florida, and then we got Iden Blue now, which did very well at a Star City event, I think in Richmond. These are similar decks. Iden is kind of in a way, the evolution of the Darth Vader deck. I think its goal is to be better into aggro than Darth Vader. Obviously, like Iden comes out earlier and is a healing leader. She's going to be more effective in surviving Sabine Barrage, like just being able to heal off that damage, whereas Darth Vader is a better finishing force than Iden and will probably do better into like Boba decks, where usually the Vader Blue deck will like control and then be able to close out a game fairly quickly with Vader. Both these decks play very few units. They are leveraging 1-for-1 removal for the most part until they get to a Super Laser Blast, which is meant to kind of reset the board. And from there, they try to take over with like Avengers. The Vader deck can start taking over with the Vader himself as well. In terms of like winning mirrors, these decks have started to get like really inbred, because for them to win a mirror, they basically have to win game 1. It's the most important game in that matchup. If you win game 1, there's often very little chance you'll even be able to finish a game 2 and 3, because these game plans in the mirror are mill. These aren't even really mill decks. There's only one card that mills. It's Vigilance. But because of how important that is in the mirror, these decks are now playing things like Restock in the main deck. And then to be able to like survive getting your Restock milled, they're playing things like Bounty Hunter Crew in the main deck to buy it back. Or they're playing Spark of Rebellion now to rip Restock out of their opponent's hand. Or they're playing a second copy of Restock, right? Or they're playing like Search Your Feelings in order to like search up their Restock. There's a lot that these decks are doing in order to just be able to beat their mirrors in game 1, and that obviously is going to weaken them into the field at large. It doesn't mean it's impossible for them to win against the field at large. It's just they are kind of cannibalizing themselves right now, and we'll see like how deep these decks really want to go. I mean, there's even more options, like playing something like Lando in my mind is an option, so that when you draw your Restock, you can hide it in your resource row and then later bounce it with your Lando. You pay 8 for it, or actually you pay 10 for it, but that doesn't matter, okay? Because these decks, like they have like 4 units that matter when they're playing mirrors. Like it's just the capital ships. If you're playing Vader, the Vader matters. But they have so much removal that it's very hard to actually like win through like playing these big units, that mostly they're just like resourcing and passing and like resourcing and drawing cards, or resourcing and killing a thing. And like, yeah, like you can play 10 for Orlando. It's fine. Like you can pay 6 for Spark of Rebellion. You can pay 8 for Bounty Hunter Crew. For me, outside of these mirrors, probably the most important impactful card that these decks present is Lieutenant Childson. He comes out most of the time as a 4-cost 6/6 Sentinel or a 4-cost 5/5 Sentinel. It's incredibly powerful, and a lot of decks need to be prepared for that card in particular, because that is a brick wall that really bridges their early to mid game. And if he prevents a bunch of damage or eats a couple cards just because they have to like use tons of resources to get through him, then he did his job, and that is a lot of how these decks beat more aggressive strategies. All right, just a little bit. I put these under like needs tuning. These are not decks I think are yet at the caliber of most of the other decks I talked about. I think in a lot of ways they're close. Like Luke Green, I think suffers a little bit in the same way that Han Green does, because it's a dog into Boba Fett, but I think it's just even more so a dog into Boba Fett. Like Luke is very much a deck that just wants to play on curve units or like 1 below curve units and shield them. It gets devastated by bounce effects, and like the mono yellow deck has 9 of them. Boba Fett in general is just usually a little too quick for Luke to kind of stabilize against. I think there is potential here with some more tuning. Looking forward to see like what people come up with Luke. I've got Boba Blue here, which, you know, we talked about the Vader Blue and Mono Blue Iden. So this is like another adaptation of like a control deck. I know, why are we playing Boba Fett in control? Well, basically, we're playing the same kind of strategy, very few units in this deck. We're just using Boba Fett because Boba Fett's good against aggro, right? Like, we're just playing him because he can help us a bit into aggro. And then Fett's Fire Spray gives us another angle to close out games that we might not have been able to close out with those other control decks. But essentially, it is still just a hard control deck. It plays like Super Laser Blast, at least the version that I'm talking about. And it's just trying to get there a different way. I think I'm interested to see, again, like how this develops over time. And lastly, Han Blue, a deck that I recently did a little deck guide on. I think it is a strong deck. I think it has play into a lot of matchups. Specifically, it's pretty decent into Sabine. Because it's playing blue, you can even mainboard it into like sort of an anti-mill deck where you play your own restocks. And then because you get to play Spark of Rebellion for 2, you might just be able to like be the better mill deck into like the Vader Blue and Iden Blue decks. It does struggle quite a bit, again, into Boba Fett. I don't think it hasn't been played as much, and thus I don't think it's as tuned as much. I will still be working on this deck. These are just, but yeah, like these three are just a little call outs to some decks that I think are like waiting in the wings. They're not, in my opinion, quite there yet, but I think they have potential to get there. All right, that's all I got. Again, if you want to see some sample deck lists, check out the article I linked in the description by TD Tada. There's just most of these decks have a deck list present in that article, and you can check them out there. If you like this video, please comment, please subscribe to the channel. Let me know if there's any decks that you think I missed that you would consider big players, or if you think any of the decks I included here are not quite at that level. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. And until next time, take care.